In the 1920s, Stephanie St. Clair became a prominent figure in New York's underworld, involved in racketeering and illegal gambling, making a fortune in the process. Known as Queenie or Madame St. Clair, she took on both the police and the Italian mafia. But eventually her criminal empire came crashing down. Join me to find out why. The circumstances of Stephanie St. Clair's birth and early life are not 100% clear, but it's believed that she was born on the island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean on Christmas Eve 1897. She was of African descent, and her mother is believed to be a woman named Felicienne, but nothing is known of her father. Despite being a single mother, likely from a humble background, Felicienne worked hard and managed to send her daughter to school, meaning she was better educated than many of the criminal rivals she would face in future years in America. Later in her life, she developed a story which claimed that she was actually from France, but this was simply part of St. Clair's own self-mythologizing. Some sources claim that when St. Clair was in her early teens, she had to leave school to tend to her mother who was very ill. She worked during this time, saved money, and after her mother's passing, she finally left the small island she had grown up on and headed for Montreal. Whatever the exact details of her birth and childhood were, we do know that she eventually set sail for the United States at some time in the 1910s. This may have occurred as early as 1911 when she was barely a teenager, or could have happened in the aftermath of the First World War. What is undeniable is that she was living in New York City as a young woman in her mid-20s by the start of the 1920s. She settled in Harlem, which had emerged in the late 19th century onwards as a staunchly African-American part of New York. Here she is speculated to have fallen in love with a small-time crook named Duke, but this soon took a turn for the worse when he tried to prostitute her, and he ended up being shot in a gang fight not long after. A few months later, St. Clair allegedly had a new boyfriend named Ed, with whom she began selling drugs. After a few months, she had made around $30,000 and wanted to leave Ed. When she told him, Ed attempted to choke her, but she pushed him away so violently that he hit his head on a table, fracturing his skull and dying soon after. Much of this speculation about St. Clair's early life is derived from a biography novel by Raphael Confiant called Madame St. Clair, Reine de Harlem, or Madame St. Clair, Queen of Harlem in English. How much of this is true is uncertain, but what we can be sure of is that she joined the 40 Thieves, a century-old crime gang in the city which traced its roots back to the 1820s, and she would soon branch out to illegal gambling. Stephanie St. Clair became infamous for her involvement in what was known as the numbers business, or numbers game. This emerged owing to the racial politics of the time, which largely excluded African Americans from investing on Wall Street. The numbers business, or policy banking as it was also known, was a complicated way of circumventing this ban. Those who ran this policy banking staffed bank headquarters and financial companies with controllers, messengers and clerks who were in their pay. They simultaneously ran lotteries, which were in many ways alternatives for those who wanted to invest in the New York markets. Individuals filled out the lottery slips or policy slips provided by the operators of the numbers business. These were then ran over to the banks and financial houses where those in the employ of the runners of the numbers business invested certain sums of money on certain things depending on the details on the lottery slips. In this way, individuals in Harlem, which was enjoying a massive economic boom in the 1920s, could invest money in New York without those who ran the city's financial operations ever knowing who was investing money. Others were simply gambling on what the day's financial results from Wall Street and the banks would be. If the authorities ever looked into any of this, those who ran the numbers business would claim they were running an innocent community lottery. This numbers business was largely a form of gambling based on New York's financial sector, and was illegal under the laws of the time. St. Clair began establishing herself as a player in the Harlem's number business from the early 1920s onwards, though it is unclear how exactly she raised her initial seed capital to start out. Perhaps it was from her time in the drug business, but we can't be sure. Contemporaries described her as an arrogant but sophisticated and educated woman, with a fierce temper that she would often direct at her rivals. St. Clair's personality helped her to succeed in this business, and by the mid-1920s, she was making a sizable income, by taking a percentage of all the money staked on the numbers business. She also ran multiple iterations of the lottery. One of the most popular was a lottery that used numbers which were pulled from New York clearinghouse on a daily basis. Those who placed bets with St. Clair would bet on a number between 1 and 999. The bets were usually small, a nickel being considered a sizable bet, but with thousands of participants on a daily basis, the amount of money involved could become very large over time. St. Clair and her employees would then generate winning numbers based on two numbers: the daily clearance figure for the member banks of the New York Clearinghouse and the Federal Reserve Bank credit balance. So, St. Clair's lottery was a form of gambling, but it was a version which rewarded some knowledge of the stock market and New York's financial world at the time. There was a lot of money to be made from this, and many individuals from New York's underworld were involved in the numbers business throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. As a result, St. Clair became rich from it, and she became known throughout Manhattan as Queenie, but Harlem residents referred to her as Madame St. Clair. By 1930, one New York journalist estimated that she had amassed a personal fortune of roughly $500,000, a sum equivalent to nearly $10 million today, while she also owned several apartments and houses in Harlem. St. Clair's entry into the Harlem underworld did not go unopposed for long. Her primary competitor for the numbers business in North New York was Dutch Schultz, born as Arthur Flegenheimer. A native of the Bronx, Schultz was a mob boss of legendary temper and violence, who had emerged as a major New York criminal in the 1920s following his entry into the bootlegging business. By the late 1920s, he had more than 100 people working for him, and was viewed by some New York prosecutors as public enemy number one in the city. He was deeply associated with the mafia in the city and leading figures like Charles Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, though they viewed him as something of a loose cannon. With the end of Prohibition seeming imminent in the early 1930s, Schultz began to muscle in on St. Clair's business, delivering her an ultimatum to either relinquish her business to him altogether or begin paying him a sizable percentage of her profits. Many others had caved to pressure from Schultz, but St. Clair wouldn't be one of them. In the early 1930s, Stephanie began organizing her remaining clients for an intensive opposition to Schultz. When they learned that store managers and other business owners in Harlem were collecting bets for Schultz, they violently confronted them, entering their stores and smashing up the business in a campaign of intimidation. Madame St. Clair even put out ads in the Harlem newspapers encouraging residents to play black, by which she meant not to place their money with Schultz and instead support her as a local black woman. Schultz quickly responded with a campaign of intimidation against St. Clair, one which quickly escalated into kidnappings and murders. A contract was even placed on Stephanie's head, leading St. Clair to begin using a series of safe houses in Harlem. At its height, this campaign of brutality led St. Clair to have to hide under a heap of coal to avoid being killed by Schultz's men during one encounter. Because of this, she maintained a low profile and passed on her criminal business to her chief enforcer, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. By the end of the conflict, over 40 people had been killed. Eventually, the conflict between St. Clair and Dutch Schultz would end in victory for Stephanie. Yet this was more owing to the unpredictability of New York's complicated underworld politics in the 1930s than anything St. Clair managed to do. The relationship between Schultz and Lucky Luciano, the head of the Italian mafia in New York since the late 1920s, had always been tense, and things came to a head when Schultz disobeyed a direct command from the commission headed by Luciano. At the time, Schultz was being charged with fraud and tax evasion by Thomas Dewey, a senior New York City special prosecutor, so he made plans to have him killed. This was in spite of the fact that the Mafia Commission warned him against doing so, as they feared that Dewey's murder would provoke an all-out crackdown. As a result, the Commission determined that Schultz had to be stopped. On the 23rd of October 1935, he was shot while sitting on a toilet in a restaurant in Newark in New Jersey. He died from his injuries the following day. As he lay dying, St. Clair sent a telegram to Schultz saying, "As ye sow, so shall you reap," and signed it as Madam Queen of Policy. The telegram reportedly made headlines across the nation. While she'd been in conflict with Dutch Schultz, St. Clair had also been periodically involved in a tussle with New York law enforcement. This was both owing to her involvement in the numbers business, but also her activism within Harlem. By the late 1920s, she had begun placing ads in local papers which aimed to inform African Americans of their rights should they be harassed by police or arrested. This led in due course to her emergence as a community leader. The two things combined to make Stephanie the subject of a campaign by New York police, and in December 1929, she was finally arrested. Eventually, she was convicted of gambling and other crimes, and was sentenced to 8 months in a correction workhouse, where she had to undertake hard labour. St. Clair emerged from a workhouse in late 1930 with a determination to exact revenge on law enforcement in New York. This was right around the time that a series of investigations led by Judge Samuel Seabury to uncover corruption within New York's politics, police and judiciary was being launched. St. Clair was soon providing insider information to the Seabury Commission, alleging that police throughout the city harassed black numbers operators like herself, while turning a blind eye to those associated with more well-established organised crime outfits. Her testimony ultimately led to the arrest or dismissal of 1 police lieutenant and 13 rank-and-file police. St. Clair's notoriety reached a peak in New York in the mid-1930s as the woman who had established herself as an independent numbers business operator in Harlem faced down one of the city's toughest gangsters in Dutch Schultz and exacted revenge against the cops who had contrived to send her to prison in the late 1920s. Her infamy continued to grow in 1936 when she elected to enter a non-legal marriage contract with Bishop Amadou Al-Mu'minin Sufi Abdul Hamid, an eccentric and controversial New York race activist at the time, whose anti-Semitic rants earned him the nickname Black Hitler. Hamid claimed to have been born near the pyramids of Egypt and spoke to rallies across the city wearing a turban and cape. The reality was that he hailed from Massachusetts. By the time he and St. Clair became involved in the mid-1930s, he had established himself as an individual who courted the German-American community and engaged in fiery rhetoric against the city's Jewish community. His and Stephanie's contract in 1936 stated that they would be married for a 1-year trial period. If it worked, they would enter a formal marriage union, but it never got that far. Hamid was unfaithful and engaged in several affairs. When St. Clair learned of one of his romances with Madame Fou Fatam, a fortune teller and mystic from Jamaica, she shot him 3 times on the 19th of January 1938. Although Hamid was barely wounded in the attack, with the bullet simply grazing him, St. Clair was charged with attempted murder. During the sensational trial that followed, Hamid admitted to being in reality Eugene Brown, but that wouldn't change much. In her defense, Stephanie claimed that she confronted Hamid because he had been treating her cruelly, and that the gun went off during a struggle between the two former lovers. The judge was not convinced, stating that St. Clair had, quote, been living by her wits all of her life, and sentenced her to 2 to 10 years in prison. She was sent to serve her sentence at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women north of New York City, in Westchester County. St. Clair was released from prison in the early 1940s. Little is known about her life after this, and she intentionally kept a much lower profile during these years. There would be no more paper ads declaring the rights of the African American community of New York or attempts to break back into the city's criminal underworld. Though she was no longer in command of her numbers empire, she was still a wealthy woman thanks to smart investments and retired to a mansion on Long Island, while engaging in legitimate and legal business deals in the 1940s and 1950s. Her associate Bumpy Johnson, who after St. Clair became the reigning king in Harlem, came to live with her during her later years and wrote poetry from her house on Long Island. The few fleeting references to her business activities in these years come from his statements and reveal a woman who was happy to enjoy a quiet retirement. She died in New York in 1969, aged 72. When she passed that December, the newspapers contained no news of the demise of the former Madame St. Clair. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Stephanie St. Clair. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed to get all my videos as soon as I upload them, and that you have notifications turned on. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.